Envision a nation driven by safe, efficient fuels that significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions and the cost of fuel at the pump. One that no longer relies on foreign sources of vehicle fuel and keeps our farmers secure in their future in agriculture. Our country is already on the path to making this image a reality, and the Renewable Fuel Standard, or RFS, is motivating progress towards that goal. My name is Cynthia Walters, and I'm a student at Penn State University. I'm now in my senior year of the Energy and Sustainability Policy Bachelor of Arts degree. During this video, I hope to demonstrate how the RFS is fighting to increase our energy security while reducing the transportation industry's negative impact on climate change. The RFS uses multiple types of renewable, advanced, biodiesel, and cellulosic fuels to meet the requirements of the program. Blending these renewable fuels with gasoline reduces the amount of fossil fuels burned and also enhances the renewable fuels industry. Just 1 bushel of corn can produce 2.85 gallons of ethanol. Biorefineries are popping up across the nation, thanks to the industry boost from the RFS. These biorefineries only use the starch in corn to make ethanol, and then the protein, fat, and fiber is returned to the market as livestock feed for dairy cattle, hog, poultry, sheep, and fish farms. Cellulosic ethanol can be made from plant matter composed primarily of inedible cellulose fibers that form the stems and branches of most plants. Certain energy crops, such as switchgrass and giant miscanthus, are capable cellulose sources that can be easily produced in many regions of the United States. It is my belief that cellulosic and advanced biofuels need to see more commercial scale growth and funding in the United States. I will soon cut to a live presentation where I'll go into a little more detail about the RFS for a group of environmentally conscious citizens. The presentation was held next to the Susquehanna River, and although the forecast called for a downpour and flash flooding, thankfully nothing more than a light drizzle appeared during the speech. Some of that drizzle may be heard throughout the recording, which I hope does not distract from the content of the material being presented. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my thoughts on this important piece of legislation, which I am certain will have far-reaching and positive impacts on our country. Well, I'd like to start by thanking all of you for joining me today. I am currently in my final year at Penn State's Energy and Sustainability Policy degree, and I'm looking forward to finishing up and getting started with the remainder of my career. So, thanks again for everybody for being here. My friend Susie Brown is here with us today, and she's going to play a little bit of music while I talk, and afterwards she'll give you a little show. So we'll go ahead and get started.
Josie, come here.
I'm going to be talking about the Renewable Fuel Standard and a little bit of information on what it's about and some analysis and recommendations that I've done. And if you guys have any questions during this presentation, you're welcome to raise your hand and ask questions. And I will appreciate it, and I will give you as much feedback as I can. So the Renewable Fuel Standard mandates that fuel that's sold for transportation or heating oil in the United States contains a certain blend of fuel from renewable sources. And Congress created this policy in 2005 with the Energy Policy Act, and then they advanced it and extended it quite a bit with the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007. The Renewable Fuel Standard sets volume standards in 4 different categories of renewable fuels for each year through 2022. In order for a renewable fuel to qualify within one of those categories, it needs to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to less than the 2005 petroleum baseline. So if the renewable fuel does not reduce greenhouse gas emissions by at least a certain amount more than a 2005 petroleum baseline, it does not qualify for the program. Each year, the amount of renewable fuel that must be blended increases, and that's one of the several controversial pieces of the Renewable Fuel Standard. And the agency that's responsible for enforcement of these standards is the EPA. They announced last year that they would be considering some changes to the compliance of the program, and also some other changes that might occur after 2022 and the possible revisions that could greatly impact the program, and I'll talk about those later. These volumes are mandated to increase annually, and they culminate with 36 billion gallons by 2022. The expectation is actually that more advanced biofuels will be produced than unspecified biofuels, such as corn ethanol, to move away from food and feed crops as primary renewable fuel sources. According to the statute, advanced and cellulosic biofuels should account for 60% of the 36 billion gallons in 2022, while cornstarch ethanol will ultimately only make up 40% by that year. The goal is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which advanced and cellulosic biofuels are much more effective at than cornstarch ethanol. So some of the major players that are involved in lobbying and providing input for the Renewable Fuel Standard include biofuel and renewable fuel groups and associations, ethanol groups, and groups that are fighting against the RFS are chiefly those involved in the oil industry. The Renewable Fuels Standard is a threat to the oil industry because it reduces the need for petroleum products in the United States. The stakeholders with interests in the RFS are vast and varied, with many different views and ideas on issues such as the purpose of the RFS, if or how the RFS is properly designed, and whether or not it accomplishes its goals. I'm going to talk a little bit about the renewable identification numbers, which are assigned to each gallon of gas that is blended with renewable fuels. So refiners and importers have to comply with the requirements of the RFS by blending renewable fuels into their refined transportation fuel, and they can demonstrate their compliance by submitting renewable identification numbers. And they have to submit a satisfactory amount each year in each of the 4 categories. There's different amounts required for each of the categories. And the RINs are assigned, as I said, to each gallon of renewable fuel, and they can be traded or purchased among refiners. And so if a refiner is unable to meet the standard for that year, they can actually purchase RINs from other refiners that have blended more renewable fuels into their gas. Obligated parties, which are the refiners and importers that exceed their required amounts, can actually roll over any unused, while those who fail to meet the goals will carry a deficit into the next year. So renewable fuels must meet the components of a fuel pathway in order to be assigned an RIN, which is a renewable identification number. And the fuel pathway includes the feedstock, production process, and fuel type. There are currently 4 categories under the RFS, and each one of those 4 categories gets assigned a renewable fuel category or D code. One of those categories is cellulosic biofuel, which has to be produced from cellulose, hemicellulose, or lignin, and it's assigned D code 3. Another type is biomass-based diesel. Another type is advanced biofuel, which sometimes gets lumped into biomass-based diesel. And then finally, renewable fuel covers cornstarch ethanol for the most part, and then other random ones that don't meet the higher standards. So there are requirements that I mentioned earlier in the reductions in life cycle GHG emissions, that's the greenhouse gas emissions for each of the fuel categories. And renewable fuels, so cornstarch ethanol, only requires a 20% greenhouse gas reduction as compared to the 2005 petroleum baseline. And the advanced and biodiesel fuels require at least a 50% reduction. And then if it falls into a cellulosic fuel category, it has to meet at least a 60% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Now that also takes into account direct and significant indirect emissions, including land use changes. The Renewable Fuel Standard doesn't actually require that corn ethanol today or at any time is necessary for the program. One of the most common misconceptions is that the RFS requires a certain amount of corn ethanol to be used, but it actually limits corn ethanol to 15 billion gallons. Corn ethanol is but one of many renewable fuels that can qualify toward the undifferentiated volume requirement of the RFS. One of the concerns with the RFS is something called the blend wall, and that's considered the amount of ethanol that our country can use if all of the gasoline sold contains at least 10% ethanol. Most vehicle warranties won't cover an ethanol blend above E10 or 10% ethanol and 90% gasoline. However, there is debate over whether ethanol is actually bad for your vehicle, and if the oil industry is using the blend wall just to hold back progress in renewable fuels. The requirements in the RFS have forced the blend wall to be surpassed. Just last year in 2016, data showed that each gallon of gasoline that was sold in the US actually contained a little bit more than 10% ethanol. It was initially thought that when the ethanol industry broke the blend wall, RIN prices, those are those renewable identification numbers, those prices would rise for trading and purchasing. However, when the blend wall was breached in 2016, the RIN prices did not rise. RFS supporters believe that allowing the blend wall to be broken will motivate investment in infrastructure that can better handle higher levels of ethanol. Ethanol continues to face hurdles in vehicle and infrastructure compatibility. Many vehicle warranties are no longer valid after you've used a greater than 10% ethanol blend. And although the RFS policy has made it clear that ethanol blends would eventually surpass 10%, oil companies and their partners have not invested in the necessary changes to infrastructure and vehicles to allow this development. 9 out of every 10 cars at this point on the road are approved for E15 use, which is 15% ethanol and 85% gasoline, including more than 25 million flexible fuel vehicles that have been designed to use any fuel. So I believe that the EPA should reconsider and update its current life cycle analysis of GHG emissions for corn ethanol under the Renewable Fuel Standard. The Department of Energy and other independent studies have determined that the carbon intensity is much lower than what the EPA has estimated for cornstarch ethanol. They've estimated at 23%, but it could be much higher than that, the GHG reductions. One of the independent analyses completed by ICF International, which was contracted by the USDA, released in January of 2017, indicated a large difference in the EPA's calculation. The EPA's life cycle GHG reduction thresholds are set in comparison to, of course, that average petroleum fuels used in 2005, and the renewable fuels threshold is set at 20% or more, meaning that the ethanol must release at least 20% less emissions than released by a petroleum fuel in 2005. Currently, the EPA has determined that cornstarch ethanol releases 23% less than the baseline. However, the recent ICF analysis calculated that back in 2014, life cycle corn ethanol greenhouse gas emissions were already 43% below the 2005 petroleum baseline. And they also estimated that by 2022, corn ethanol's carbon intensity would be as much as 70% below the EPA's calculation. I believe that vehicle manufacturers have been building flexible fuel vehicles for many years. However, the infrastructure is still lacking stations with E85 refueling ability that's needed to be more widely available for those vehicles. Government fleets now use flexible fuel vehicles, and even the Ford Model T created back in 1908 was a flexible fuel vehicle that could run on gasoline, ethanol, or any combination of both. 9 out of 10 cars currently on the road are approved for E15 use, which includes over 25 million vehicles that can use any blend of ethanol. Many vehicle owners do not realize that their vehicle is compatible with high ethanol blends, which should be addressed by vehicle manufacturers. The American manufacturers should be required to clearly label vehicles so that consumers are aware of their options when they're fueling. And tax incentives such as credits for the difference in cost to install E85 pumps should be in place, along with other policies encouraging the expansion of infrastructure at the fuel pumps. Consumer choice and availability should be considered with all new installation of refueling stations. Advanced biofuels or second-generation biofuels could alleviate some of the concerns associated with the use of ethanol, as they do not require new pumping infrastructure or drastic modifications to vehicles' engines. However, technology for advanced biofuels has not developed as anticipated. Therefore, the cost to convert biomass to cellulosic biofuel is still higher than ethanol. Research and funding is needed to enhance the process to a more economical method. This slow development has caused the EPA to reduce volume standards for cellulosic biofuels, which will in effect slow the development of conversion technology even further. Cellulosic is ethanol that's produced from cellulose, that's rather than from the plant's seeds or fruit. It's biofuel produced from grasses, wood, algae, or other plants, and it's the fibrous parts of the plants, which are mostly inedible to humans, especially humans, except for ruminants like cows or sheep. And second-generation biofuels, which are also known as advanced biofuels, are those that can be manufactured from various types of biomass, like giant miscanthus. Biomass is a wide-ranging term, meaning that any source of organic carbon that is renewed rapidly as part of the carbon cycle. It's derived from plant materials, but can also include animal materials. Concern over the delayed growth of commercial-scaled advanced cellulosic biofuels has led the EPA to reduce the standard for these categories. Reducing these standards could slow the development and growth of technology and commercial scale availability for these fuel types. Advanced and cellulosic biofuels have a much higher life cycle GHG emission reduction as compared to gasoline, and therefore they have a greater positive impact on the climate. One of the federal programs that are available for biomass development is the Biomass Crop Assistance Program. That was proposed to stimulate the industry of second-generation biofuels. Private sector investment is vital to establishing an industry, but the private sector is reluctant to invest when there are major obstacles, such as limited availability. And BCAP attempts to fix this problem through its two statutory purposes. The first purpose is to support the establishment and production of eligible biomass crops, and the second is to help offset the costs of collection, harvest, storage, and transportation. And they refer to that as CHST. The CHST portion of the program was intended to help the industry develop new types of biomass, find new ways to produce biomass, and increase the production of advanced biofuels. The advanced and cellulosic biofuel industry currently faces a lot of uncertainty and obstacles on the path to expanding commercially. Stability will drive investment, while uncertainty and reductions weaken the growth of technology for more efficient conversion. Programs like BCAP could help to stimulate advancement for second-generation biofuels, but technology must improve for economically sound commercial scale production. I mentioned waivers and volume reductions earlier. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Waivers and volume reductions will reduce the efficacy and lead to economic uncertainty of the program. Cellulosic biofuel has been hit the hardest with waivers and reductions, which has led to reductions in the total advanced biofuel volume requirements. These volume requirements can drive the technology and development of renewable fuels that replace fossil fuels. And the RFS is a highly technical and multifaceted program which has the ability to impact many industries of the economy and reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere, and thus impacting climate change positively. The current EPA proposal for 2018 renewable volume obligations and 2019 biomass-based diesel volumes maintains the conventional renewable fuel, or ethanol, levels at the statutory maximum of 15 billion gallons for 2018. But it reduces the cellulosic biofuel in 2018 down to 238 million gallons, which is 73 million gallons less than this year. The Renewable Fuels Association is a group of supporters of the Renewable Fuel Standard, and I believe that they should attend the public hearing that is scheduled for August 1st, 2017 to voice their concerns with the proposal reduction in cellulosic biofuels. This proposal, while it's acceptable in the ethanol standard, will cause harm to the growth and industry of cellulosic biofuels. I believe that the Renewable Fuel Standard has been a successful program in many different ways. The use of renewable fuels in place of conventional gasoline leaves our air cleaner and helps our nation's farmers while reducing our dependency on foreign sources of energy. The RFS has now been in place for over a decade, and measurable progress has been demonstrated in the direction of the policy's intentions. Thanks to the RFS, renewable fuels have increased in production and use, while technology has advanced to improve efficiency and conversion of those fuels, including corn ethanol. These renewable fuels have replaced a substantial amount of gasoline. To put it in perspective, all of the annual crude oil production from the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, the Keystone XL, and Bakken, and an additional billion gallons would make enough gasoline to replace the amount of renewable fuel created due to the RFS. The transportation sector has reduced its greenhouse gas emissions by 43.5 metric tons in 2016. Ethanol production has supported nearly 340,000 jobs across the nation. Farm income and agricultural products have increased, while renewable fuel industry jobs have been created and biorefineries have more than doubled. Many of the negative outcomes that were expected by those opposing the RFS have either failed to happen or quite the opposite has occurred. Consumers now pay between 50 cents and $1.50 less per gallon thanks to the Renewable Fuel Standard and domestic ethanol production. Overall, sweeping changes to the RFS should not be considered and will only reduce or reverse the progress that has been made thus far. The program has replaced billions of gallons of gasoline with renewable fuels that not only make the air we breathe cleaner, but also reduce greenhouse gas emissions that impact climate change. The Renewable Fuel Standard leads to more energy freedom in the United States and less reliance on foreign sources of energy. And I believe that this is paving our nation's path to a safer, cleaner energy future. Does anybody have any questions about the things that we've talked about today? I do want to mention that there is a website that you can go to, fuelfreedom.org, if you want to determine if you have a flex fuel vehicle if you aren't sure. And that a lot of our local Sheetz locations have E85 and E15 fueling stations available. There's websites that you can also go to that I have to determine which locations have those. I know the one on Allentown Boulevard has that availability, and Carlisle Pike has one. So, any questions?
So,
I want to thank you guys.
The industry's still growing. I mean, it's
the industry
still,
is.
it's not going anywhere.
It's still a slow and steady pace, and it's growing. At this point, we really need to invest in the cellulosic and advanced biofuels that are available and try to make them more efficient and easier to convert into usable fuel.
Home heating oil with
Home heating oil with that, yes. It's home heating oil is one of the requirements. It's transportation and home heating oil is what they need to blend.
I don't know what you're getting. They just bring out. It's not like there's
right. They don't make that clear to consumers whether or not.
There's not like different grades. Like, hey, I want the high test like home heating oil. Like this is heating oil.
I'm not really sure how or if there's any kind of requirement for those that sell home heating oil to notify those that are buying the consumers if they're actually blended and how much is blended and how that could impact your home's furnace. I really will have to look more into that, but I can let you know later. Thank you for asking questions. Well, thank you all for joining me today. I really appreciate your time, and now Susie's going to give you guys
Shakespeare in the park, and later it got dark. Put your hand in mine, and it stopped time. We sat out on a bench, it rained, we got drenched, but I didn't seem to care. Catching fireflies couldn't amount to all the time kept with you. Shakespeare in the park, and later it got dark. You put your hand in mine, and it stopped time. We sat out on a bench, it rained, we got drenched, but it didn't seem to care. It's catching fireflies couldn't amount to all the time spent with you. Come back to if I knew we'd be through. I wouldn't have gone from the start. Now the curtain cord is pulling my heart. Shakespeare in the park, and later it got dark. You put your hand in mine, and it stopped time tonight.
Once again, thank you for taking the time to listen to my thoughts on the Renewable Fuel Standard, and also for showing an interest in our nation's energy security. With all of the challenges faced by the RFS since its enactment, it has remained steadfast in meeting its goals and expectations. The program still has many obstacles to address, but the EPA has found ways to continue with progress. Advanced and cellulosic biofuels are in need of attention, investment, and more efficient technology. Vehicles and infrastructure will have to be modified to meet the growing demand for renewable fuels. Stability is needed in the market and for renewable identification numbers. The RFS is a program of many layers, but few major objectives. Increase our energy security, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and build renewable fuel industries.